Today we are talking with journalist Lee Van Der Voo, the author of the very well-written book called The Fish Market: Inside the Big Money Battle for the Ocean and Your Dinner Plate. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you for having me.
Most people think of seafood and they don't think of fish and fishermen. What got you into writing this book, which is a fascinating account of what is happening in the ocean and not just on the earth?
Well, to be candid about it, somebody bet me in a bar that they could get me to write the story.
And you took the bait, so to speak.
I took the bait, yeah. I had just written an article about salmon, and I was in a bar, and I was with a bunch of writers, and I was loudly complaining about how I was never going to do it again, that I thought stories about seafood just didn't connect with general readers. And somebody bet me on the spot that they could get me interested in doing it again. And they started telling me about a new national policy called catch shares, and how that was, intending to boost the economic health of fisheries and make fishing safer and bring better products to market, but that it was having the downstream consequence of unraveling the economic fabric of coastal communities. And being interested in social justice issues, I did dive in again.
Most common men have very little idea about what is happening in the fisheries and how people can fish and who has access to fishing, how that is all changing what they see on their dinner plate.
Sure. Well, how it's changing is through regulatory change. So, as I said a moment ago, there was a new policy push in the United States that was intended to just bring better products to market, make them more valuable, and make fishing safer. And I guess the catalyst was this, that the United States puts limits on how much seafood can come out of the ocean next year every year, really, with the idea of, you want the seafood that you catch in one season to be there again next year and the following year and in 10 or 20 years. But the way that cap is enforced can vary. And previously it was causing a race to fish. It was just controlling the amount of effort in fishing and on the sea by making the window that one could go and fish in narrower and narrower and narrower to control how much was caught. And it had the effect of creating a race to fish. I mean, it would put boats on the water really for 24 hours. The halibut season in Alaska, for example, it was a 24-hour season. There was an actual starting gun. People would rush to the water, and whatever the weather, there were horrible accidents. Gear would get tangled, and people would just cut it off and leave it to ghost fish because they didn't have time to deal with it. And then all the products would just pile up on the docks in heaps while processors struggled to keep up with them. And so really all you could do was freeze it. And that's kind of encapsulates what the problem was. That's why that fish was in a frozen brick in the grocery store for $2.99 a pound. So the idea was, can we pre-assign the catch to individuals? It'll make them safer. They can go out in better weather whenever they want. And then they can get better care of these products, and the products can become more valuable. So that's how you get to your $28 halibut fillet. But this policy tool that divides the catch in this way, it's called catch shares. How it works is that the government takes the pie, if you will, of all the fish that can be caught and then slices it up and gives it away in ownership to fishermen, sometimes corporations that fish. But it was a little bit of a gamble. It was betting that ownership equals good stewardship, and that if, for example, you gave 100 people houses, they'd all cut their grass. Nobody really knows. And the effect of that actually was quite mixed. And what happened was lots of people did become good stewards, and they today are people who are bringing incredible products to market. And I follow some of those in my book. But many also just simply became landlords. And now workers have to rent the right to go and catch fish from these people that own the access to the fish and to the sea. So it makes the industry harder to climb, and it's beginning to unmoor that small business fabric that has underpinned the fishing industry and coastal communities for so many years, and it's moving more of the ownership toward investors and corporations.
Very well. So just to explain a little bit the backdrop, how did we get here, is that the fishing was always considered a common property, that the fishermen would go and fish there. But as the environmentalists raised the issue of sustainable fishing, so that way we can have the fish for a longer time, all these different ideas and policies, tools started coming in. So now we have a limited catching available, and the fishermen are slowly being either forced out or leaving the profession or the trade, and big money, so to speak, is coming in, just as happening in the farming that has happened rather, or on the farms, that the big money is taken over after industrial farming just 50 years ago.
Yeah, it is very similar to land-based farming in some ways. In this case, yeah, fishing used to be, you would buy your license and anyone could go to sea and catch commercially. But now, as the government slices the pie and gives those slices away, they do originally most of the time land in ownership with fishermen. But what happens is, as the value of the fish then becomes more valuable, you look at halibut going from that $2.99 to $28 a pound in 20 years. Fishermen just don't need to go to sea anymore, and they can still make an awful lot of money. So they rent those properties, and it becomes that when they are fully retired, they want to sell them. There's no one in the industry who has climbed the ladder. Folks who are renting, it's like trying to buy a house from a landlord that's always raising the rent on you. There's a downward pressure on their wages, so when their owners finally sell, they're not the logical buyer. So you have investors stepping in and buying up these properties in cases, and sometimes corporate owners like seafood processors on the coast that typically would just have the job of filleting the fish now are owning the market in this way. And so that's how you get to where the economics start to move away from the people doing the work and in the communities doing the work.
And as you brought up the issue of the cash share, which has become the predominant policy tool of the U.S. government and regulators, if you can explain what cash share is and how it came to being used now more and more since the enactment of the Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1976, but it really is going in just 10 years ago, and how it is affecting the coastal communities and fishermen families.
Well, a catch share is, as I described, the government taking the pie and of the fish that can be caught and slicing it and giving away those fish in ownership. That's a catch share. Essentially, you cap the amount of fish that can be caught. You divide up the rights to fish them and give them away to people. That's how the government executes a catch share.
But the government doesn't have the ongoing revenue, and once it's given away for free based on the existing market share, and the government is out of it.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't function like any other natural resource in that way. Like the timber industry rents the right to log in federal forests. Same in the mining industry or solar or wind or geothermal on public lands. They're going to pay lease fees to the federal government to access those natural resources. That's not the case in a catch share. When you start to privatize the right to go to sea, that right never comes back to the public. And so as these properties become more and more valuable, you can see them trading on seafood exchanges that are kind of like the stock exchange, but exclusively for fish access. And they're handled by brokers with that specialty. They trade, they're quite lucrative, and the public sees no return on those trades. And once those rights are given away, they're private market for good.
And that's where the problem comes in, and that's where also where the big money comes in, because where is the social justice? Where is this sovereignty? Who owns the fishing rights, or who owns the ocean? Because if it is already sold by the U.S. government, then we may be at the mercy of the big money.
Yeah, it really raises a question of sovereignty for our coastal communities and people that fish, and what is their right to be who they are, where they are, and to have a relationship with the natural resource that is their nearest neighbor. There are some really, really incredible products that have been built within these systems, and you could certainly say that they make a business case for privatizing the sea because the big money is there, and it enables people to innovate in ways in seafood that perhaps they hadn't been able to before. Banks and fishermen, not real strong relationships before fishermen had these private property rights. So there are some gains, but the cost is, in many, many coastal towns, very high. I have talked to fishermen in the crab industry in Alaska, Deadliest Catch. People love to watch that show and see how exciting the sea is and how dangerous, and really just be in awe of how difficult that work is. What's often not talked about is those folks are paying 80% at times rental rates as high as 80% in order to be there. There's a lot of money in that business. They still feel the wage is worth it. But when you consider that there's somebody on the couch who is making 80% of the revenue of those treacherous voyages, it really raises a lot of questions about equity.
In the book, you bring up a lot of different issues, and I think you touched upon on fishing, how fishing of pollocks in Alaska has changed, and how grouper, red snapper, and from fish after fish, Gulf whale, all that has changed. Would you explain, maybe take an example of the pollock, that how fishing has changed after the cash share program?
Sure. One of the biggest changes is that it's becoming more industrial. When we talk about these properties migrating from Joe Fisherman to the fish processor to the investor, we're in a situation where the deeper pocket prevails. So these properties are consolidating and consolidating, which means bigger and bigger boats to go to catch more. It's all about economic efficiency. So those little boats that ironically catch our fish most sustainably in many cases are beginning to be retired, and we're moving more toward industrial fisheries. And so that's where we get to the pollock, that's always been a fairly industrial fishery in that it's on the Bering Sea. That is a rough, mean place, and it's dangerous enough that it's always been large boats out there. It's never been tiny boats that would be suicidal to go and do. But now, we're up to that fishery. I think it's had 2 decades in a catch share. This was one of the earlier ones in the United States, maybe slightly more than 2 decades. Some of those boats out there they're football field in length. They're several decks. They have factories on board. People work on them in 2 shifts a day, doing things as stacking boxes in a freezer, one after another. The pollock is sort of the preeminent fast food, sustainable seafood, right? It's fodder for McDonald's Filet-O-Fish sandwich, for the Subway Seafood Sensation sandwich, and lots of other fast food fare. It's the main ingredient in most of the Gordon's freezer products that you see in the grocery store, so fish sticks and grilled fillets. And you would think that it comes off the boat in a fillet. That's really not quite how it works. Aboard those ships, these fish are flash frozen in blocks that look like dimensional lumber, and they're stored that way. They're brought to shore that way. They're then distributed to the next array of landside conveyor belts that cuts them into whatever they're supposed to look like. And that's how you're getting that, that nice square in your Filet-O-Fish sandwich, is through this very, very industrial process. There's no arguing that it feeds annually billions of people at a cost that most people can afford. But I don't think it's what people think of when they think of sustainable seafood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Also, the industry, sustainable fishing, one of the things it was supposed to do was to provide, or at least sustain, also the employment in the industry or for the fishermen, but that hasn't happened either.
Right, and that's not the metric, which is interesting. The metric for sustainable seafood is that you can catch the amount that you're catching, and the fish will still return. That particular fish will still return over time. There's been a lot of criticism of the Marine Stewardship Council, which is the main certifying organization for a lot of sustainable seafood, in that it doesn't take more human consequences into account, and at times doesn't take into account even sort of companion environmental outcomes. For example, the pollock industry, those pollock keep coming back. That's a fish that has returned in fairly robust numbers. But folks who live in that region will say that, the industrial scale catch of that fish has impacted the livelihoods of marine mammals. There's some debate over that, but certainly you could say there's a population decline of marine mammals that may be related. It's known that there's a decline in seabirds that is related. There's bycatch of halibut and salmon that is regulated, but and by bycatch I mean accidental catch. It's regulated, but it's enough that it makes catching that fish more difficult for the people who live in that area and use their little boats around their shores. So there are all kinds of collateral consequences to fishing at scale like this. The Marine Stewardship Council and other certifying agencies often don't take those into account, or don't take them into account that's sufficient for some of their critics. And likewise, these impacts to workers, the private ownership consolidation, and the downstream pressure on a workforce that in every way really is becoming the new American sharecropper and having to rent the right to go to sea, that has not been acknowledged or really taken into account in any way in the certification process.
And as you point out in the book, St. George and St. Paul Islands in Alaska sometimes have obviously fallen behind or left behind, and especially when almost $2 billion worth of fish flow out of the ocean, and yet they don't get even a penny.
Yeah, there's certainly, I think, a quote in the book from the mayor of St. George, Pat Plitnikoff, who says, not one plug nickel sticks to St. George. Interestingly, some of these large-scale fisheries, they do set some money aside in rural Alaska to benefit rural Alaskans, but there's always clamoring over those funds, and they don't necessarily always reach the areas that they were intended to benefit. And St. George is one of those places now. It's a really rough place to live. It's out in the middle of the Bering Sea. It's so windy there that trees can't grow. It's very, very cold. It's hard to grow anything. So folks are very dependent on the ocean for the resources to sustain themselves. There's a lot of sustenance catch of the fish on the shore. They eat marine mammals, they eat seabirds. So when I talk about, these kinds of impacts from industrial scale fishing, those do have very human consequences for folks who want to stay on their island and have been there for hundreds of years. This type of scale of fishing does make it more difficult for them.
And I'm sure while researching the books, you ever had pleasure and opportunity to be on many of those fishing trips and understand on firsthand what it takes to be on the ocean and on the ship in a very time compressed, with a very focused way of getting the job done and come back to the shore.
Yeah, it was really important to me to get out on the boats and put my hands on things and really experience, what it's like to be a fisherman. And I also just thought, this is a topic that deserves to be told with some flair. I mean, as you know, the book itself is pretty pacey. There's a lot of interesting stories, lots of action on the ocean. I really wanted to bring that in because it's such a neat and exciting place and community. That was one of the attractions of writing this book. But yeah, like the pressure to produce seafood on a timeline, it's definitely still there, even though catch shares theoretically gave fishermen the opportunity to control their own schedules. The marketplace is a reality, right? So there's all kinds of pressure, and when you add in landlords, interestingly, that pressure can increase. Alaska, for example, in the halibut industry, there was a real effort to tether these owners to boats, and they're actually required to ride along on the vessel on which their fish are caught. That rule set, it was designed to encourage fishermen to sell and to divest of these properties as they aged out and really keep halibut in the hands of operator owners of fishing boats. But what's happened instead is that you see now young captains who are renting the right to fish and take their crews out there begin to really pimp out their boats to attract these guys to ride along. So they're on the boats, but they're not doing anything. And you see that every season start, the colorful mailers start to fly around advertising. Well, I've got 500 DVDs, I've got a big screen TV, I've got a sauna, I've got game meat on my boat for you, I've got a stateroom, anything that's going to attract that guy to be on your boat. And he's still going to get somewhere from 50 to 70% of the value of the catch for doing absolutely nothing. And I rode out on one of those vessels just to see what that was like. And it was, of course, you don't have the pressure then of having to catch the fish in the way that the government used to require, but that guy doesn't want to be on the boat forever, so you've got the pressure of getting him back to shore and getting his fish caught as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. We've been speaking with Lee Van Der Voo, the author of The Fish Market, Inside the Big Money Battle for the Ocean and Your Dinner Plate. Give us a little bit more what got into or what it took to complete the book. Once you took the bet or you took the bait, and then what happened? You had a little bit of history of writing some articles on the topic, so you had some familiarity. So then, was it difficult to get on the boat? So was it difficult to piece it all together, or how long it took you to get the book done?
Well, it was like a 5-year odyssey of reporting. I took the bet. I brought the idea to an editor at Investigate West. He helped me in writing a grant that supported the initial project, came from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. And a few weeks later, I was on a plane to Alaska to write a few stories. And our goal was, that I was going to write 3 articles. And I thought, hey, these are going to be great stories. I'll come back and I'll move on to the next thing. But it really just opened up the topic for me, and I saw how rich it was, and I wanted to spend some time with it. So I became, the following year, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellow, which meant I had a whole year to travel the U.S. I went to every catch share in the United States, walk the docks, talk to people, get a sense of how this was affecting the nation. I did write a handful of articles during that process as well, but in the end, I had this mountain of reporting that I felt like was never going to fit in a magazine or a newspaper. So I wrote the book proposal over the next year and got the contract, and then spent the following year going out to sea on some of these vessels and getting more of an experience of life on the water to color the narrative. So yeah, then just editing over 2016, and there it is, finally, almost 5 years later.
The issues that are related or driving the cash share program also have a much wider implication on social justice, on income distribution, on how the winners and losers are created, how the communities are affected, and how sovereignty is affected. Do these people who are engaged in these profession or trade, do they think that they are responsible in some ways changing it, or profit is the sole motive they have and that's all they care?
Sometimes I meet folks who really do feel that they have a role in improving the industry, and some of them do. I follow the company Gulf Wild in the telling of this story to look at how they manage a sustainable seafood brand. And one of the things that they've done, which is so fascinating, is they're, I believe, the first and only company in the world to trace each individual fish from its place in the ocean through the supply chain to the consumer. So what that means is you buy a fish from them, usually a grouper or red snapper, and you plug a number into their website, and they can tell you who caught that fish, on what boat, with what gear, how they brought it to shore, where it landed, who processed it, and then who brought it to the grocery store or the restaurant where you consumed it. That kind of transparency has never been had in seafood before. It really is quite incredible. And those folks take a portion of the proceeds that they make off of a premium that they get for that product, and they reinvest it in conservation projects in the Gulf of Mexico where those fish are caught. Their story is really quite an amazing story, and it's the bright side of this whole transition. I think catch shares really bet that everybody would be like them. In the end, only people who hold their values, who believe the way that they believe in their responsibility toward ocean conservation as a company, have become stewards as they have become stewards. Nevertheless, their story is very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Now, all these things are happening. I mean, the market value of these rights are growing only because seafood is becoming more popular, and more people are willing to pay higher prices for the seafood or the fishes that are brought to them. If that backdrop were to change, then the willingness of all these people to pay more for those rights, fishing rights in the ocean, will also change, wouldn't it?
Well, yes and no. Yes, if the bottom would fall out, but I don't think that's very likely, because the ability in a catch share economy to bring that fish to market slowly over time, as opposed to just landing it all on the dock in a heap in 24 hours, that builds consumer appetite. It gives consumers a chance to become more familiar with the products that are available to them from the American seas, as opposed to just seeing them once in a while, being like, I've never had that. I don't know if I want to try it. And then letting the opportunity pass until next year. Now that halibut is available fresh for much longer than it used to be. Same with a lot of other fish, and that's why you see that, and also the predictability of the supply, the ability to build relationships with individual fishermen is why you see so many chefs get behind catch shares. It makes serving the public so much easier. And in that way, I think the consumer relationship with seafood is really only being fostered. I do think what's more likely than the bottom falling out and all these dynamics changing is that seafood continues to be something, particularly wild seafood, that is the fare of the white tablecloth. I think it's going to get fancier and fancier and as expensive as chefs and high-end grocers can push that price for sustainable seafood. So maybe wild seafood in the future becomes a food for well-to-do people. I don't know. Maybe it will become less accessible. You even see that pollock that feeds billions around the world at a very low price right now, starting to make that leap. I see it in very high-end sustainable sushi restaurants, branded as a sustainable product, certainly getting much fare in sustainable seafood salads and things like that than it has ever had. So my bet is that that's the trend more than bottom ever falling out.
A wider acceptance of the product, and that may be linked with the higher prices, but also better quality of the product.
And a willingness of consumers to pay a premium for a sustainable product.
Are you looking at some other projects and write another fascinating book and put your skills to one more test one more time?
I'm not sure what's next. Right now I'm working on an educational project about illegal seafood and how the United States keeps it from getting into the marketplace. That's more of a series of articles that I'll be producing in a web format. That for me was in many ways just kind of an opportunity to ride the learning curve of international seafood, international regulation, and see what could be out there for reporting next. I'm really interested in the geopolitics of that space. I think I probably will continue with some seafood reporting in that area, and there could be another book in there, but I'm not quite sure yet.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and I urge our listeners to pick up the book and read it. It is a wonderful book. It tells a fascinating tale, and it's written and tells it very well. Thank you.
Thank you.